He had everything a man could want: power, money, a wife who made every room look like it was built around her. Dante Moretti ran the East Coast like a chess grandmaster who'd never lost a game. But the most dangerous player at the board wasn't a rival boss, wasn't a federal agent, wasn't even the ghost of someone he'd ordered buried. It was the woman who poured his coffee every morning and smiled like she didn't know a single thing. She knew everything. And for 18 months, she said nothing. She just waited. If you've ever underestimated someone you loved, keep watching. This one's going to hurt. Like the channel, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it started, the morning Vivian Hart decided that her marriage was over and something far more deliberate would take its place. She was standing in the kitchen of their Upper East Side townhouse in bare feet on cold marble, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, watching her husband lie to her face with the practiced ease of a man who had been lying his entire adult life. Dante was at the island counter, jacket already on, checking his phone with the kind of focused attention he used to reserve for her. He was 51, broad across the shoulders, with silver threading through dark hair he kept cut close to his skull. He had a jaw that looked like it had been designed to say no, and eyes, gray, almost colorless in certain light, that most people couldn't hold for more than a few seconds. Vivian had spent 12 years learning to hold them. "I'll be back Thursday," he said, not looking up. "You said Wednesday last week." "Plans changed." He pocketed the phone, reached for his espresso, drank it standing up. "Meeting in London pushed. I don't have time to go through the calendar with you right now." "I wasn't asking you to." He looked at her then, just for a second. That flat, assessing look, the one he used when he was deciding whether something required actual attention or could be dismissed. Vivian had seen him use it on accountants, on lawyers, on men who owed him money. The fact that he used it on her the same way he used it on them told her everything about where she stood in his internal ranking system. "You seem tense," he said. "I'm fine." "You sure?" "I said I'm fine, Dante." He set the cup down, picked up his briefcase, and crossed the kitchen toward her. He kissed her on the temple, dry, perfunctory, the kiss of someone completing a checklist item. And she felt the faint scent of his cologne and something underneath it, something floral and feminine that was absolutely not hers. She didn't move. She didn't stiffen. She'd had 4 days to get used to that smell. "I'll call tonight," he said. "Okay." He left. She heard the elevator, the lobby door, the mechanical silence of the building swallowing him up. Then she set her coffee cup down on the marble counter very carefully, sat down on the cold floor with her back against the cabinet, and breathed. Not crying. She was past crying. She'd done that part 4 nights ago, alone in the guest bathroom with the shower running so the housekeeper wouldn't hear, sitting on the tile with her knees drawn up and her hand pressed over her mouth. She'd given herself 40 minutes and then she'd stopped, washed her face, and started thinking. That was what Vivian Hart did. When the world fell apart, she stopped feeling and started thinking. It was what had made her so good at her job, before Dante. She'd been 31 when they met, and already building a reputation in forensic accounting that made corporate lawyers nervous and financial regulators take her calls on the first ring. She could read a balance sheet the way other people read a novel, following the plot, noticing when characters behaved out of character, tracking the points where the narrative broke down and something uglier showed through underneath. Dante had hired her consulting firm to audit one of his legitimate holding companies. She'd found nothing wrong, which was either because there was nothing wrong or because she hadn't yet learned where to look. She'd found him, though, and he'd found her. And within 14 months, they were married in a ceremony in the Hamptons that cost more than her parents' house. And by 33, she was Vivian Moretti, and the brilliant forensic accountant had become the elegant wife. She told herself she was still herself. She told herself that for 12 years. Now she sat on the cold kitchen floor and admitted, quietly, to no one, that she'd put herself to sleep. And she was awake now. The first thing she'd found 4 days ago wasn't the affair. The affair was almost incidental, almost a footnote compared to what came after it. She'd been looking for something else entirely. Dante had asked her 3 months ago to review some paperwork on a new development project he was structuring. Something about the corporate layers didn't feel right to him, he'd said, and she was better at that kind of read than his lawyers. She'd agreed. She'd done it the way she used to do things, back before she'd softened, back when she was sharper and less careful about what she looked for. She'd followed the thread. The thread led somewhere Dante had not intended it to lead. She'd found the accounts on a Tuesday evening while he was at dinner with city council members, and she was alone in his home office, which she'd been allowed to use because she was his wife, and because he trusted her the way powerful men trusted their wives, completely, in the way you trust furniture not to move while you're away. She'd been tracing corporate ownership through a Delaware-registered shell company called Auric Meridian Holdings, which connected to 3 other entities she didn't recognize, which connected to a series of accounts in the Cayman Islands and Liechtenstein that moved money in patterns so deliberately complex, she felt her pulse quicken the way it used to quicken when she found something genuinely wrong. 2 hours in, she'd found the name that didn't belong. Sienna Vale. Not as a person, not immediately. First as a corporate signatory on 2 of the shell companies. A name attached to an account. The name meant nothing to her in that context. She'd written it down and kept following the money. The money led to other names, other structures, and a scale of operation that made her sit back from the screen and spend a full 5 minutes staring at nothing. She was looking at what appeared to be. She was being careful, very careful. She wasn't going to jump to conclusions. A multi-layered financial laundering structure, moving what her preliminary estimate put it somewhere between $200 million and $400 million, through holding companies, art purchases, real estate transactions, and charitable foundations. Not just Dante's money. Money that came from places she recognized, investor pools, partnership accounts, syndicate funds she'd seen referenced in documents Dante had brought home over the years. Other people's money. A great deal of other people's money. She'd stopped at midnight, sat in the dark of his office for a long time. Then she'd gone upstairs, gotten in bed, and lain there with her eyes open while Dante snored softly beside her. The next morning, she'd searched Sienna Vale's name, social media influencer, 26 years old, Manhattan-based, 140,000 followers on one platform, growing. Lifestyle content, restaurants, travel, fashion. A face that was genuinely beautiful in an unworked, natural way that somehow made it worse. And in a photo from 8 weeks ago, at a gallery opening that Vivian now remembered Dante attending for, a client event she'd been too tired to join, there, in the background, almost out of frame, Dante's hand at the small of Sienna Vale's back, the hand of a man who owned something. Vivian had put her phone face down on the bathroom counter and finished brushing her teeth. And then she'd started planning. The planning was the part that surprised her. She'd expected rage or grief, or the kind of cold paralysis she'd seen other women collapse into when their marriages detonated. What she felt instead was something almost clinical, a crystalline, clear-edged focus that she recognized from the best years of her career. The feeling of a problem presenting itself. The feeling of a mind with the right tools clicking into gear. She loved Dante, or she had once. She wasn't certain whether what remained was love or scar tissue, and it didn't feel like the most important question right now. The most important question was what she was looking at and what she was going to do about it. She needed more information. She needed to be certain. She needed to understand not just the affair, but the full shape of the thing she'd stumbled into, because her preliminary read of those accounts suggested something that went well beyond a husband deceiving a wife. What she was looking at, if she was right, was criminal on a scale that implicated a lot more people than Dante Moretti and a young woman with a lifestyle brand. So she became a ghost in her own house. She was good at that, had been good at that for 12 years without fully realizing it. She moved through rooms, she smiled at the right moments, she attended the dinner party they'd already committed to and wore the green Valentino dress that Dante had said he liked, and made conversation with city officials and investors and their careful, polished wives. She laughed at the right times. She refilled glasses. She was the perfect picture of everything a man like Dante Moretti needed beside him in a room. And at night, after he fell asleep, she worked. She had access to more than he realized. That was his first mistake, or rather his most recent one in a long series. He'd given her access to certain systems years ago for legitimate purposes, and he'd never thought to rescind it because she'd never given him reason to think she would use it against him. Access to the accounting software his CFO used, access to the document management system where contracts and agreements were stored, access to the secure email archive through a shared login he'd set up, and apparently forgotten about because powerful men forget the small administrative details when they believe themselves to be untouchable. The picture that assembled itself over those 18 days was staggering. She found communications between Dante and his consigliere, Vincent Russo, discussing the structure of what they referred to, never by its real name, but clearly enough once you knew what you were reading, as the exit. A planned dissolution and disappearance of assets on a timeline that appeared to target sometime in the next 12 to 18 months. Dante's legitimate business interests would be sold, quietly, to entities he controlled through proxies. His criminal infrastructure would be left to collapse. Partners, investors, employees, anyone who was implicated or owed money or expected a return would find themselves holding nothing when the structure came down. He was building himself a trapdoor, and beneath the trapdoor was a new life, well-funded and carefully insulated, from which he would watch everything he'd built burn and feel nothing. Vivian read a communication between Dante and Russo from 5 months ago, discussing what to do about a man named Caruso, a bookkeeper who'd apparently begun asking questions about discrepancies in the offshore accounts. In Dante's words, the solution was to deal with it the usual way. 2 weeks later, she found a brief news item she'd somehow missed at the time. A man named Frank Caruso, age 53, had been found dead in his car outside his home in Hoboken. Apparent cardiac event. She sat with that for a long time, longer than anything else she'd found. This wasn't about money anymore. This wasn't even about the affair. This was about the fact that she was living with a man who ordered people killed and then came to bed and slept easy and kissed her on the temple in the morning and told her he'd call. There was no version of this story where she walked away and said nothing and started over somewhere and pretended she hadn't seen what she'd seen. She wasn't built that way. She'd understood that about herself for a long time, but she'd managed to bury it under 12 years of comfort and complicity. She could admit that word now, complicity. She'd been complicit even if she hadn't known, and not knowing didn't sit clean with her, and she had to do something about it. But she also had to survive. That was not a small thing. The men whose money Dante had stolen were not the kind of men who accepted losses graciously, and when this came apart, and it was going to come apart, there would be a period of maximum danger for anyone in Dante's orbit, including his wife. She needed to move carefully. She needed to do everything in the right order, and she needed to get out before she made a move that couldn't be unmade. She found the penthouse 2 weeks in, almost by accident, a property she didn't recognize in a search of real estate holdings attached to the shell companies. A building in Midtown she'd never heard him mention. She crossed it against Sienna Vale's residential address from a public record search. They matched. So Dante was keeping her, not in some discreet, deniable way, in a signed and papered shell company-owned penthouse in Midtown. Practical, in a certain light. Tie her to the financial structure, make her a signatory, make her technically implicated so she had incentive to stay quiet. Dante was always practical. It was one of the things she'd admired about him once. She didn't go there immediately. She sat on the information for another week. She kept copying files, methodically, systematically, everything she could access, organized in a structure on an encrypted drive she kept in a shielded pocket of her gym bag, the one place in the house where she could be certain he'd never look. She built a case the way she'd been trained to build cases, with the rigor of a professional and the patience of a woman who had stopped being in a hurry the moment she understood what she was dealing with. She built a list of names: federal prosecutors, financial crimes investigators, journalists who covered organized crime with documented track records of source protection. She didn't contact them yet. She wasn't ready yet. She waited for the moment Dante told her he was leaving for London. She waited for the moment she knew exactly where he would be. And on a Thursday evening, while the city did what New York does in late October, pulled its collar up against a wind with teeth, let the lights come on early, moved fast, and didn't make eye contact, Vivian Hart put on her coat, took the elevator down to the lobby, stepped into a cab she'd called from a new phone purchased with cash, and gave an address in Midtown she'd never spoken aloud before. The building was the kind that had a doorman who made eye contact with residents and not with guests, and a lobby with limestone floors that absorbed sound, and an elevator that opened directly into the penthouse, because when you paid enough for privacy, you got architecture that enforced it. She'd thought about the access problem. She'd solved it 3 days ago by making one phone call, to a locksmith she'd used years ago for a legitimate client job, a man who asked no questions and remembered nothing, and who'd confirmed that the building's penthouse units used a commercially standard lock system that responded to a certain kind of override. She had the card in her coat pocket. She'd tested it at the lobby door when no one was watching. It worked. She rode the elevator up. The city fell away below her through the floor-to-ceiling glass on the east wall. All lit windows and moving lights, and the indifferent sprawl of everything that had been happening out there while she'd been living her careful, suffocated life on the Upper East Side. She looked at it without sentiment. The elevator opened. The penthouse was large and decorated with the taste of someone young who'd been given money and access to a designer. Expensive, deliberate, slightly performative. Candles. A dining table set for two, dishes half finished. A bottle of wine open. Music playing softly from somewhere, something without words. Dante was on the couch with his jacket off. Sienna was beside him, her legs across his lap, her head turned toward the door, with the sudden frozen alertness of someone who has heard something they weren't supposed to hear. And Dante looked up. He'd been laughing at something. She could see the tail end of it still on his face, the opened-up, unguarded version of his expression that she'd stopped being the cause of sometime around year 4. It died completely when he saw her, replaced by something she'd genuinely never seen on him before. Not anger, not calculation, fear. It was brief. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, and then the mask came down and his jaw set, and he started to move, started to stand, to organize himself, to prepare whatever version of this he was going to try to run. He was very good at recovering. She'd always known that. "Vivian, sit down," she said. Her voice came out flat and unhurried, which surprised her a little. "I can explain—" "I know you can. You can explain anything. That's something I've always admired about you." She stepped further into the room, unbuttoned her coat, didn't take it off. "I didn't come here for an explanation." Sienna was watching her with wide, careful eyes, a young woman trying to read a situation that had gone somewhere her experience hadn't prepared her for. She'd started to pull her legs off Dante's lap, creating space, doing the instinctive physical distancing of someone who suddenly wanted not to be in the room. "Then what did you come for?" Dante asked. He'd found his footing now. The fear was almost entirely gone from his face, replaced by the careful blankness he wore when he was assessing threat. She was threat. She could see him processing that. "I came to let you know," Vivian said, "that I know about Auric Meridian, and the Cayman accounts, and the Liechtenstein structure, and the exit timeline, and Vincent's involvement, and what happened to Frank Caruso." The room was very quiet. The music kept playing, incongruously soft. Dante didn't move. He was good at not moving when it mattered. She watched something travel through his eyes. Recognition, calculation, the rapid restructuring of a threat assessment, and come out the other side as something cold and still and dangerous. "Be very careful," he said, quietly, the way he said things when he was most serious about them. "I am careful," she said. "I've been careful for 18 months. You should have been more careful too." Sienna stood up quietly and took several steps toward the kitchen. Neither of them looked at her. "Whatever you think you found," Dante said, "you don't understand what you're dealing with." "I understand exactly what I'm dealing with. I spent 10 years professionally understanding exactly what I was dealing with before I became your wife. Did you forget that? I think you forgot that." "Vivian." He took a step toward her. Not aggressive, something that might have looked to a stranger almost like a man moving toward reconciliation, toward his wife, making himself smaller and more human. She knew what it actually was. She'd seen him do it in negotiations. Close the space. Reduce the other person's sense of threat until they made a decision they wouldn't have made from a safe distance. "Let's talk about this." "Not here. Come home." "I'm not coming home tonight," she said. "I wanted to look you in the face when I told you. I thought you deserved that much." She paused. "Maybe I was wrong about that." She turned and walked back to the elevator. Her hands were completely steady. "If you do anything with what you think you found," Dante said behind her, and his voice had changed now, stripped of everything that wasn't threat. "You will not survive it. You understand me? Not you, not anyone you've talked to, not anyone who's touched those files." She pressed the button. The elevator doors opened. "Vivian." His voice cracked very slightly on her name. She wasn't sure if it was anger or something else. She didn't turn around to find out. "Good night, Dante." She stepped in. The doors closed. The city reappeared through the glass as she descended, cold and lit and going about its business 40 stories below, and she stood in the elevator with her hands folded in front of her and breathed slowly and thought about the next 8 days and everything she still had to do. She told him she knew. That had been calculated, not impulsive. She'd thought about it carefully, had run the argument both ways, and landed on the conclusion that giving him that moment, that warning, served a purpose. Not for his benefit, for hers. She needed him off balance. She needed him focused on her and what she might do, rather than on what he might be missing elsewhere. A man who'd been warned by his wife was a man thinking about his wife. A man thinking about his wife was a man not thinking clearly about everything else. She had 8 days before the things she'd already set in motion would begin to move. She'd been careful. She'd been very, very careful about the order of operations. What she copied, when she copied it, where she put it, who she had touched it, and who had not. The encrypted drive in her gym bag was not the only copy. There were 3 others, in 3 different locations, held by 3 people she trusted in ways she didn't trust Dante Moretti, a former colleague who'd moved to Washington and asked no questions. A lawyer she'd used for a personal matter 6 years ago, whose confidentiality she'd never had reason to question. And a safety deposit box in a bank in New Jersey under her birth name, Hart, that Dante didn't know existed because she'd opened it 4 years before they met and never closed it. She wasn't impulsive. She'd never been impulsive. It was possibly the truest thing Dante had ever said about her, back in the early years when he'd said it as a compliment. The cab she'd arranged was waiting at the building's side entrance. She got in, gave an address 3 blocks from the townhouse, watched the city go by through the window. Her phone buzzed, Dante's name on the screen. She watched it ring out. Then a text. "We need to talk, tonight." She put the phone in her bag. The cab moved north through the city, threading the evening traffic, and Vivian Hart sat in the back seat with her coat buttoned and her mind already on the morning. 8 days. She just needed to hold the line for 8 days. She'd already waited 18 months. 8 days was nothing. But she'd seen his face when she'd said Vincent's name. She'd seen what happened to his expression when she mentioned Frank Caruso. And she knew Dante well enough to know that a man who'd had people killed for asking questions would not spend the next 8 days doing nothing. The cab stopped at a light. Rain had started, tapping against the windows. The driver said something about traffic on 5th, and she said it was fine. She wasn't in a hurry. Her phone buzzed again. Not Dante this time. A number she didn't recognize, a number she'd assigned weeks ago. A certain flag in her contact list, coded. The kind of number that meant a piece she'd placed was moving. She answered. "It's done," the voice said. One of the journalists she'd been in preliminary contact with, she'd gone no further than preliminary, hadn't given anything yet, just established the channel, confirmed the interest was real. "We've confirmed the meeting, but our editor is asking for a preview, something concrete. Timeline for the rest?" Vivian looked out at the rain-dark street. "Tell your editor he'll have everything he needs within the week," she said. "Everything. And your safety? We've been through this. My safety is my problem," she said. "Your job is to be ready to publish the moment you receive the package. Everything else is handled." She ended the call. The light changed. The cab moved forward. Across the city, in a midtown penthouse, Dante Moretti was picking up a different phone. And somewhere in the machinery of what Vivian had built, a clock was already running. The call Dante made lasted 11 minutes. She didn't know this yet, would learn it later from records she hadn't yet accessed, in a version of events that would be assembled long after the night was over. But she would have recognized the number had she known it. Vincent Russo, cell, called at 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October, duration 11 minutes, from a penthouse in Midtown that Dante Moretti was not supposed to own. What was said in those 11 minutes she could only approximate. But she knew the 2 men well enough, had watched Vincent Russo sit across from her at 100 dinners, had noted his habits of thought, his particular brand of cautious brutality, to know that the word her name had been spoken in that conversation was not the word of a man who planned to do nothing. She was not surprised 3 hours later, when she noticed the car parked outside the townhouse that had not been there when she'd left. Dark, engine off, positioned so that its occupant would have line of sight to both the front entrance and the side service door. The kind of parking job that looked exactly like how someone would park if they were trying not to look like they were watching. She stood at the window of the guest bedroom. She'd had no intention of sleeping in their bed tonight, and watched the car for a while. She'd planned for this too, but something about seeing it in reality, after all the months of abstract planning, made the situation feel newly concrete in a way that arrived somewhere below the thinking brain, somewhere that understood danger as a physical fact rather than a calculated risk. She stepped back from the window, sat on the edge of the guest bed, put her hands flat on her thighs and felt them shaking, just slightly, for the first time since the kitchen floor that morning. Then she pressed them flat until they stopped. 8 days. Just 8 days. She lay down on top of the covers in her clothes, set her phone on the nightstand, did not sleep for a very long time. In the morning, when she checked the window again, the car was still there. The car was still there at 6:45 in the morning. Vivian had not slept. She'd lain on top of the guest bed covers in her clothes and stared at the ceiling and listened to the building. The settling of old walls, the distant percussion of the city, the elevator moving twice in the small hours, which could have been a neighbor and could have been something else. She'd tracked every sound the way she used to track numbers. No interpretation until you had enough data, no conclusion until the pattern held. At 6, she got up, washed her face with cold water, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment without particular feeling, and went to the window. The car was a black Audi sedan, parked 40 feet from the entrance on the opposite side of the street. Different driver than last night. She could tell by the shoulder angle, the way the head sat, a slightly different silhouette, which meant they'd done a shift change sometime in the night, which meant this wasn't improvised. This was organized. Dante had made calls and people had answered them, and now her building was under watch before the sun had finished coming up. She stepped back from the window, went to the kitchen, made coffee. The housekeeper, Rosa, arrived at 7:15, and Vivian was already at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a second cup in front of her, looking, she hoped, like a woman who'd woken up early for ordinary reasons. Rosa was 58 and had worked for them for 9 years and noticed everything without commenting on any of it, which was either admirable discretion or the silence of someone who'd learned that noticing things in this house was a liability. "Good morning, Mrs. Moretti." "Morning, Rosa. There's coffee." Rosa moved around the kitchen with her practiced quietness. Vivian watched the screen in front of her and thought about the car outside, and thought about the 11-minute phone call she'd reconstructed from inference, and thought about what kind of morning Vincent Russo was having right now. Her phone was on the table beside the laptop. At 7:22 it lit up. Dante. She let it ring. It stopped. 30 seconds later, a text. "Vivian, pick up the phone. We need to handle this like adults." She put the phone face down. Rosa said something about the dry cleaning, and Vivian said that was fine without processing what she'd agreed to. And then she was alone in the kitchen again, and she pulled the phone back up and opened the contact she'd coded 3 weeks ago with a name that meant nothing. D. Farrow, Consulting. She typed, "Timeline acceleration may be necessary. Confirm receipt of preliminary package." 3 minutes passed. Then, confirmed. "Need primary documentation before we can proceed. You know what we're waiting for." She did know. The preliminary contact, the journalist, a man named Garrett, at a mid-size outlet with a documented history of organized crime coverage, and more importantly, a legal team that had successfully resisted 3 prior subpoenas, had received enough to establish that she was credible and that the story was real. But the full evidence package, the archive she'd assembled over 18 months, was sitting on the encrypted drive in her gym bag and in 3 other locations, and she hadn't moved it yet because moving it too early meant exposure, and exposure meant danger, and she'd planned to wait until day 6 of the 8-day window. She might not have until day 6. She closed the laptop and thought about that for a while. The problem with acceleration was sequencing. She'd built the timeline carefully because the order in which things were released mattered. The prosecutors needed to receive certain documents before the journalists published, so there was an official record already in motion that couldn't be recalled or suppressed. The journalists needed to publish before Dante's lawyers could move for injunctions, so the information was already in the public domain by the time his legal team understood what was happening. If she rushed any part of it, the whole structure could collapse. She could end up having exposed herself without the protection that exposure was supposed to provide. She could end up like Frank Caruso. She got up and rinsed her cup in the sink and stood there with her hands on the edge of the counter and let herself think that plainly. Frank Caruso had found a discrepancy. He'd asked questions. He'd been found in his car in Hoboken with no marks on his body and a coroner who'd apparently asked no questions of his own. That was what she was dealing with. She'd known it for weeks in an analytical sense, but the car outside and the shift change in the early morning hours had moved it from analytical to physical in a way that tightened something in her chest. She was not going to be Frank Caruso. She had prepared extensively to not be Frank Caruso. But preparation assumed a certain amount of time, and the car outside suggested that time was compressing. She needed to talk to the lawyer. His name was Arthur Belling, and she'd used him for the preparation of her personal will 6 years before the marriage. A minor thing, an afternoon's work, but she'd liked the way he operated. Careful, not flashy, absolutely meticulous about what he knew and what he was willing to be associated with. She'd recontacted him 8 months ago under the pretext of updating the will. She'd had 2 more meetings with him since then. He knew enough to know what she was involved in, not all of it, but enough to understand the severity. And he'd made no moves to distance himself, which told her something about his willingness to be useful. She couldn't call from the townhouse phone. She couldn't call from her regular cell, which she had to assume was being monitored or would be monitored shortly. She went upstairs, got the secondary phone from where she kept it, inside the lining of a coat that had hung at the back of the closet for 3 seasons, and called Belling's direct line from the second-floor landing. He answered on the second ring. "Yes, it's me. We have a timing issue." A pause. She could hear him adjusting, straightening, the small sounds of a careful man collecting himself. "How severe?" "Surveillance started last night. I'm operating on a shorter window than we discussed." "How much shorter?" "I don't know. That's the problem. I'd planned for 6 more days. I don't know if I have 6 more days." "The materials are in the locations we discussed. All of them. Nothing's moved yet." Another pause, longer. "If you accelerate the primary transfer now, without the preparation steps you outlined—" "I know," she said. "I know the risk. Do you understand how exposed you'd be between the transfer and the publication? There's a window there where—" "Arthur." She said his name quietly, and he stopped. "I understand the window. I'm asking if there's a way to compress the preparation steps without eliminating them. Some of them. The preliminary prosecutorial contact can go out today if you authorize it. I can make that call this morning, establish the record. That covers the legal protection piece, the journalistic side. Garrett is ready. He's been ready for 2 weeks. Then the gap is the archive itself, moving it from where it is to where it needs to be, in a way that doesn't lead back to you before the protections are in place." "I know. I won't do that part," he said. Not unkindly, just clearly. "That part is yours." "I know that too," she said. "Make the prosecutorial call this morning." "Understood." She ended the call, stood on the landing for a moment, listening to the house. Somewhere below, Rosa was vacuuming. The sound was ordinary and absurd. She went into the bedroom, the main bedroom, Dante's bedroom, and opened his closet. She stood in front of his suits for a while, looking at them the way you look at evidence. What does this tell me about who this person is? The suits were expensive and numerous and arranged by color, which she'd always thought was a detail that revealed something about him, that need for visible order in the spaces he controlled. She'd never said so. She went to the safe behind the closet's rear panel. She'd known about the safe for years. It wasn't hidden from her. He'd given her the combination in the early years as a gesture of trust or performance of trust and never thought to change it. She opened it. Inside, cash, about $40,000 in mixed currency. A passport she recognized as one of 3 she knew he had. 2 phones she didn't recognize. She left everything except the passports. She photographed them, put everything back, closed the safe. She was taking photographs of the second passport when she heard the elevator. She stood still, listened. The elevator reached the lobby level. She could hear the machinery, but she didn't hear it come back up. She waited 30 seconds. Nothing. She put the phone in her pocket and went downstairs. The lobby was empty. She checked the front door camera on the small monitor by the entrance, a system she'd had installed 3 years ago at her own request, telling Dante it was for her peace of mind while he traveled. He'd found it vaguely amusing, the way he found small concessions to her anxiety vaguely amusing. She'd found it useful. The monitor showed the outside steps and the sidewalk in front of the building. The Audi was still there, but now there was a second car, a gray Escalade parked further down the block that hadn't been there an hour ago. She stood in the lobby looking at the monitor for a long time. Two vehicles, different makes, different positions, covering different angles. That was professional. That was coordinated. That was not a man who was angry at his wife and making impulsive decisions. That was infrastructure. Someone had deployed infrastructure, which meant Vincent had been busy. She was still in the lobby when her phone buzzed. The regular cell, Dante again. She answered it this time. Vivian. His voice was controlled, carefully neutral, the performance of a reasonable man. I think we got off to a terrible start last night. I'd like to... There are two vehicles outside the building, Dante. Silence. I counted a shift change at some point between 2 and 4 this morning, she said, and the Escalade arrived in the last hour. So I'm going to save us some time here. Whatever conversation you're trying to have, it's not the one we're actually having. More silence. When he spoke again, the reasonable performance was mostly gone. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From yourself. You don't know what you've walked into. You think you read some documents and you understand what this is. You don't understand what this is. You're laundering money from syndicate partners, she said. You're planning to disappear with it. When you disappear, the people whose money it is are going to want it back from whoever's left standing. That's what I walked into. The silence this time had a different quality. She could almost feel him recalibrating through the phone line, adjusting to the fact that she knew more than he'd assessed. She could feel him arriving at the conclusion that she was a larger problem than he'd initially categorized her. Whatever you think you're going to do, he said, and his voice was very quiet now. I need you to stop, right now, before this gets to a place where I can't... He stopped. Started again. Where things happen that can't be undone. Things already happened that can't be undone, she said. Frank Caruso. The silence that followed was the most informative thing he'd said in the entire conversation. Come home tonight, he said finally. I'll come home. We'll sit down like adults and figure out how to handle this in a way that's okay for both of us. That's all I'm asking. And the cars outside? They stay until I know you're not going to do something stupid. She almost laughed. Good night, Dante. She paused. Oh, and it's daytime, just so you know. She hung up. She went to the kitchen, refilled her coffee, and sat down at the table and thought about what she'd just done. She'd confirmed explicitly on a phone call that was almost certainly being recorded by multiple parties now that she knew about Caruso. That was either a mistake or a calculated pressure point, and the margin between those two things was thin enough that she wasn't fully certain which it was. But she'd watched his silences, and what she'd heard in them was a man who was afraid of her. Not just worried, afraid. Which meant he hadn't figured out yet how much she'd moved, how many copies existed, how many people were already in motion. He was still operating on the assumption that she was a lone actor, one woman with an encrypted drive, and that there was a version of this where she could be talked down or managed or, if necessary, disappeared. She had to stay out of reach long enough for that assumption to become irrelevant. She heard the front door open and Rose's voice saying, Mr. Russo. And then Vincent Russo's voice, lower, saying something she couldn't make out. She didn't move from the kitchen table. She heard footsteps in the hall, Rose's retreating ones, and a heavier, more deliberate set coming toward her. And then Vincent Russo was in the kitchen doorway. He was 61, compact, with a face that had always looked to Vivian like a building that had been through several renovations without any one of them quite erasing the evidence of the ones before. He was well dressed in the careful way of men who wanted to project respectability and knew they were fighting against something in their own faces. He was carrying a coffee in one hand from a place down the street, which meant he'd been on the block for a while before he came in. He looked at her. She looked back. Vincent, she said. Vivian. He set the coffee down on the counter near the door, not near her, near the door, and put his hands in his coat pockets in a way that was meant to look casual and didn't. Mind if I sit? I do, a little, but you're going to anyway. He sat down across from her at the table. He studied her face the way she imagined he'd studied a lot of faces across a lot of tables, looking for the thing that wasn't being said. She gave him nothing. "He's worried about you," Vincent said. "I'm sure he is. I'm going to be honest with you, Vivian, because I think you deserve honesty right now more than you deserve comfortable bullshit. What you've gotten yourself into, this isn't a situation where there are good options. You understand me? There are options that are worse and options that are less worse. What Dante is offering you, he's not offering me anything. He told me to come home. He's offering you a way through this that ends with you intact." Vincent leaned forward slightly. "That's not nothing." "It's actually nothing," she said, "because the version of me that walks away from what I found isn't intact. It's just quiet." He looked at her for a long time. There was something in his face she hadn't expected. Not warmth exactly, but something that might have been, a long time ago, and had calcified into something harder and less recognizable. "You're smarter than this situation gives you credit for." "I know. Which means you know that being smart isn't the same as being safe." "I know that too." "Then what exactly is your plan here, Vivian? Because I need you to walk me through it. Because from where I'm sitting, you've made yourself the most dangerous kind of problem, the kind where there's no clean resolution." She looked at him across the table, at the face that had sat across from her at 100 dinners, at the man who had been the hand that executed what Dante's mind conceived for 25 years, without apparent hesitation or visible remorse. She thought about Frank Caruso in a car in Hoboken with no marks on his body. "I'm not going to walk you through anything, Vincent," she said. "I think you know that." He nodded slowly, like he'd expected it. He stood up, straightened his jacket, picked up his coffee from the counter. At the doorway, he stopped. "He cares about you," Vincent said. "I know that doesn't mean much right now, but it does complicate his thinking. It's the only thing slowing this down." "Tell him I appreciate it," she said. Vincent looked at her once more, long enough that she could see him filing something away, deciding something, arriving somewhere she couldn't see the destination of. Then he left. She heard the front door. She heard the elevator. She sat at the table. Her coffee had gone cold. She had maybe 48 hours before Dante's calculation shifted from she can be managed to she can't be managed. The moment that shift happened, it wouldn't matter how much he cared about her, or whatever version of caring existed in a man like that. It would become a different problem, requiring a different solution. She picked up the secondary phone, texted Belling. "Make the call now. Don't wait." Then she texted Garrett. "Move to standby, package incoming within 24 hours. Then she sat there for another minute, in the quiet kitchen of the house she'd lived in for 11 years, looking at the cold coffee and the chair where Vincent Russo had just been sitting. She needed to get the drive out of the house. The gym bag, the drive inside the gym bag's shielded pocket, it needed to move, needed to leave this building today, needed to get to the handoff point she'd identified 3 weeks ago. A locker at Penn Station, key held by someone she trusted, not reachable by anyone Dante could pressure. The problem was the 2 cars outside. She could not walk out the front door with the drive in her bag, not with surveillance on both the front entrance and the side approach. She needed to move without being seen moving, which meant she needed to think about what exits this building had that weren't visible from either vehicle position. She'd lived here 11 years. She knew every door. She went upstairs, changed into workout clothes, packed the gym bag exactly as it always looked when she went to the gym. Water bottle, towel, change of clothes arranged correctly, the drive in its pocket, and then stood in the second-floor hallway and thought about the service corridor. Every building on this block had been constructed with a shared service corridor in the basement that connected to an alley on the east side of the block, originally for deliveries, mostly forgotten now, except by the building staff who used it for trash removal twice a week. Rosa knew the corridor. Vivian had been down there once, 2 years ago, following Rosa to help retrieve something from storage. She knew where it came out. The alley exit was on the east side. Both vehicles were positioned on the west and north approaches. She picked up the gym bag and went to find Rosa. Rosa was in the laundry room. She looked up when Vivian came in, and something in her expression shifted, a slight tightening, a particular quality of caution, that told Vivian Rosa had noted Vincent's visit and drawn her own conclusions from it, which was probably not surprising for a woman who'd been in this house 9 years. "Rosa," she said, "the service corridor in the basement, the one that comes out on 73rd, is it clear right now?" Rosa looked at her for a long moment. Yes, she said finally. Deliveries don't come until Thursday. I need to go out that way this morning. Rosa's expression didn't change. I'll show you, she said, and set down the laundry in her hands, and that was all either of them said about it. She was out of the building within 15 minutes, moving east on 73rd in the early morning foot traffic, gym bag over her shoulder, putting distance between herself and the black Audi that was still parked on the west side of the building, watching a door she hadn't used. Her phone buzzed. Dante. Where are you? She didn't answer. 3 blocks east, she picked up a cab heading downtown. Inside, she pulled the drive from the bag's pocket, held it in her palm for a moment. This small object that contained the architecture of Dante Moretti's destruction, and thought about everything it had cost her to build what was on it. The cab moved downtown through morning traffic. On the drive, in an encrypted folder she'd labeled with no name at all, was a file she hadn't discussed with Belling or Garrett or anyone. It was the one piece of evidence she'd found that she'd never been fully sure what to do with. A communication, dated 11 months ago, between Vincent Russo and a man she'd identified as a senior official in the Financial Crimes Division of a federal oversight agency. The communication was brief and technical in its language, but its implication was clear. Someone inside the system was watching out for Dante, which meant the prosecutorial route, the official, protective, legal route she'd spent 18 months building, might be compromised before she ever activated it. She sat in the back of the cab with that thought and felt, for the first time since she'd started planning, something that she had to admit to herself was close to fear. Not panic. She wasn't going to panic, but she was looking at a piece of her plan that might have a hole in it she hadn't found yet. The cab turned south on Lexington. She needed to know who the contact was. She needed to know how deep it went, and she needed to know before she handed anything to anyone, because if she handed the archive to a compromised system, she might as well hand it directly to Dante. She had the file. She had the communication. She had a name, partial, a surname only, 3 letters that could belong to several officials in the relevant division. She hadn't been able to narrow it further from the documents she had access to. But she knew someone who could. She'd been avoiding using him because using him meant bringing in another person, and every additional person was additional exposure, and she'd promised herself she would keep the circle as small as possible. But the circle had just gotten more complicated. She pulled out the secondary phone and scrolled to a contact she'd added 6 months ago and used twice. Marcus Webb, former financial crimes investigator, retired 2 years ago, lived in Brooklyn, occasionally consulted for journalists and attorneys on exactly the kind of case she was holding in her hand. She looked at his number. If Vincent's contact went all the way to the division that would receive the prosecutorial brief, then Belling's call this morning, the call she'd told him to make an hour ago, might already be alerting exactly the wrong person. Her thumb hovered over the call button. The cab stopped at a light. Outside, a woman walked a dog, and a man in a suit checked his phone, and the city moved forward with its enormous and different machinery. Vivian pressed call. It rang twice. Then, Webb, it's Vivian Hart, she said. I need your help, right now. And I need to know who I can trust inside financial crimes. A beat of silence. That's a very specific question, Webb said slowly. I have a very specific problem. Another pause. She could hear him breathing, thinking, deciding. Where are you? He said. Downtown, moving. I need a location. There's a diner on Atlantic in Brooklyn. 30 minutes. 20, she said. 20, he agreed. And that was how Vivian Hart, with a drive full of evidence in her gym bag and 2 surveillance vehicles she'd just slipped and a call already in motion that might be compromised, added another piece to a board that was becoming more dangerous and more necessary with every hour. The light changed, the cab moved, and in the townhouse on the Upper East Side, in the laundry room where Rosa had returned to her work, a phone that Vivian had left behind on the kitchen counter buzzed once with a text from Dante that read, I know you left, don't do this. Rosa looked at the phone, looked at the counter, kept folding. The diner on Atlantic Avenue smelled like burnt coffee and dish soap, and something heavier underneath both of those things. Grease soaked into decades of floorboard, the specific exhaustion of a place that had been open since before anyone working there was born. Vivian got there in 18 minutes, not 20, and sat in the back booth with her gym bag on the seat beside her and her hands wrapped around a coffee she'd ordered because her hands needed something to hold. Marcus Webb arrived 4 minutes later. He was 54, lean in the way of men who'd been under sustained stress for long enough that their bodies had simply burned away everything non-essential. Gray at the temples, a face that had learned not to show much, hands that moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd spent years being watched. He'd left the Financial Crimes Division under circumstances that had never been fully explained publicly, and when she'd first researched him 8 months ago, she'd found 3 separate references to a disagreement with senior leadership over the handling of a specific investigation that had subsequently been closed without charges. That detail had been what made her add his number. He sat down across from her, looked at her face, and skipped the preliminary. "How long have you been building it?" 18 months. "And you have documentation?" "Enough to end it, but I found something last week I didn't have before." She pulled the secondary phone, opened the relevant file, turned it toward him. "This communication, 11 months ago, Russo to someone inside Financial Crimes. I have a partial surname and an account identifier. I need to know if this goes where I think it goes." He looked at the screen for a long time. His expression didn't change, but she watched something travel through his eyes. Recognition, she thought, or something adjacent to it. And then he set the phone down very carefully on the table between them. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Dante's archive." He kept everything. That was always his habit. Documentation as leverage. He kept records on everyone he dealt with. He just never thought anyone with access to the records would know how to read them. "The surname," Webb said. "The 3 letters. D-O-N. He sat back. He picked up the coffee the waitress had silently deposited and drank it, and looked at the window and the gray Atlantic Avenue morning outside it. A bus went by. A woman pushed a stroller, the city's indifferent machinery. "Donovan," he said. "Thomas Donovan, Assistant Division Director, Financial Crimes, Eastern Region." She felt it land in her chest. "You know him." "He's the reason I'm retired," Webb said flatly. "He killed the Marchetti investigation in 2019. I had 18 months of work, a cooperating witness, enough to take down 3 syndicates simultaneously. He pulled it, reassigned my team. The witness disappeared 8 weeks later." He said all of this in the voice of a man reporting weather, not without feeling, but with feeling that had been compressed and hardened into something that no longer looked like feeling from the outside. So when Belling makes the prosecutorial contact, if it routes through Donovan's division, he'll know within the hour. Webb looked at her directly. "Did you authorize that contact already?" "This morning, before I knew." His jaw tightened. "Then we have a problem." Her phone buzzed. Belling's number. She answered immediately. "Arthur?" "I made the call," Belling said, and something in his voice was wrong, compressed in a way she hadn't heard before. 20 minutes ago. The contact I used was the standard intake channel for the Eastern Division." "Who received it?" A pause that lasted too long. "I was routed to an assistant director, a Donovan." She closed her eyes, opened them. Webb was watching her across the table, and she could see from his expression that he'd read enough of her face to understand what she was hearing. "Belling, listen to me. What exactly did you disclose?" "The existence of the documentation, the general nature of the criminal activity, your identity as the source." Another pause. "Vivian, I had to identify you to establish standing. It's standard." "I know," she said. "I know it's standard." She worked to keep her voice level. "Do not make any further contact with that office. Nothing. Wait for me to call you." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Webb said nothing. He let her have the silence, which she appreciated. "How fast does Donovan move?" she asked. "Depends on what he's protecting and how scared he is. If Russo's been managing him for years, Donovan has a lot to lose from exposure. A source document identifying him specifically," Webb shook his head. "He's not going to sit on it. So Dante knows I made the prosecutorial contact. Within the hour, probably. Maybe already." She thought about this drive in the gym bag beside her. Thought about the 3 other copies in their 3 other locations. Thought about Belling, who now had a target on his back that she'd put there. Thought about Garrett, waiting on standby for a package she hadn't sent yet, whose location and identity Donovan didn't know about yet, probably. but would begin pursuing the moment Dante told him to. The copies, she said, 3 locations. One of them is with a former colleague in Washington. If Dante runs this through Donovan and they start pulling threads, Washington colleague in what field? Former regulatory attorney, private practice now. Name? She hesitated. Webb said quietly, I'm not asking so I can report it. I'm asking because I need to know how exposed they are. Claire Ashworth. He thought for a moment. I don't know her. That's probably good. He leaned forward, put both forearms on the table. Here's where you are. You've lost the official channel. Can't use federal intake because it's compromised. Your lawyer is burned, which means you need to extract him from the loop before they get to him. The drive is with you, which is the best possible place for it right now. And the story hasn't published, which means there's still a window. Garrett, she said, if I go direct to publication without the prosecutorial protection in place first, you're exposed, Webb said. But you're already exposed. The question is whether you're exposed with the story out there or exposed with it still contained, because right now, Dante can still make this disappear. Once it's published, he can't unpublish it. She understood where he was going. You're saying I compress everything, skip the prosecutorial setup entirely, and go straight to publication. I'm saying that's the option that keeps you alive in the short term. The legal exposure is a problem you can deal with later, from a position of being alive to deal with it. She sat with that for a moment. The entire architecture she'd built, the careful sequencing, the interlocking protections, had just collapsed. Not entirely, but the keystone was gone, and without the keystone, the whole structure loaded differently. I need 2 hours, she said. I need to move the copies, pull Belling out of the chain, and get the archive to Garrett in a form he can actually use. You probably don't have 2 hours. She looked at him. Then I'll need one. Her regular cell buzzed. She'd been ignoring Dante's text, but this wasn't Dante. It was a number she recognized as belonging to one of the 2 phones she'd seen in his safe that morning, the unregistered ones. He'd never used this number to contact her before. She answered it. You went to see Webb. Dante's voice, and something in it she'd never heard before. Not quite rage, not quite desperation, something that moved between the two like a weather system that hadn't decided what it was going to become. How long have you been planning this, Vivian? I want a real answer, not posturing. How long? 18 months, she said. She didn't see the point in lying now. The silence on his end was different from the silences on the townhouse call, deeper. She could hear him breathing. 18 months, he repeated. He said it the way you say something when you're trying to understand its shape and it won't hold still. While we were, the dinner in Rome, last Christmas, all of that. Yes, you were, he stopped, started again. I want you to come in. I'm not threatening you. I'm asking you to come in and sit down with me and figure out a way through this that doesn't end with everyone destroyed. Frank Caruso didn't get that conversation. The silence this time was the one she'd been waiting for, the one that told her whether she'd been right about that, whether it had been Dante's explicit decision or something that had happened in the space that his instructions created. That was not supposed to happen, Dante said finally. But it happened. It was not my order. Whose was it? Another silence. Vincent made a judgment call. And you accepted it. Nothing. Dante, you accepted it. What was I supposed to do? And there it was. The first crack, the first place where the surface gave way and something rawer showed through. He was going to take everything apart. I had $200 million in transit. I had 12 men whose livelihoods depended on that structure holding. What exactly was I supposed to do? Tell me what you told yourself, she said. Tell me what you said when you found out, so I understand what kind of man I've been living with. The silence stretched out long enough that she thought he'd ended the call. I told myself it was necessary, he said quietly. I told myself that a lot of things were necessary, and then I kept working. She thought about saying something else. She didn't. She ended the call. Webb had been watching her. He'd heard enough of the tone, if not the words, to understand something had shifted. We need to move, he said. Give me a minute. Vivian, 1 minute. She said it without heat, and he leaned back and gave it to her. She sat in the booth of the diner on Atlantic Avenue and felt for 1 minute the full weight of what she was in the middle of. Not the logistical problem, not the exposure calculation, but the human reality of it. 12 years. A man she'd chosen, deliberately, with her eyes open enough to see what he was and her heart open enough to want him anyway. And now here, in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee, holding a drive that was going to take him apart. He'd loved her in whatever distorted, self-serving, conditional way he was capable of. She believed that, and it hadn't been enough to make him a different person, and she hadn't been enough to make him a different person, and she had spent 12 years making herself smaller and quieter and less dangerous in the hope that love and comfort and elegant dinners could substitute for the things she'd given up. And a man named Frank Caruso was dead in a car in Hoboken. That was the minute. She used all of it. Then she picked up the gym bag and looked at Webb. "Let's go." They paid in cash. She'd been paying in cash for 3 days now, and were out the door and moving east on Atlantic before the waitress had cleared the table. Webb walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, scanning the street in the practiced, unhurried way of someone who'd spent years doing it professionally. "The handoff point you had for the drive," he said. "Penn Station Locker. Is that still viable?" "I don't know who's watching the station. Scratch it. Where's Garrett?" "He gave me a contact protocol. I call a number, get a location." "Use it." She pulled the secondary phone, dialed. It rang 3 times. A voice she didn't recognize, not Garrett, someone else, a woman, said simply, "Yes?" "This is the source. I need to speak with Garrett. He's been expecting your call. Can you get to Red Hook in 40 minutes? She looked at Webb. He gave a small nod. "Yes," she said. "Pier 44. There's a warehouse, the 3rd building from the water on the south side. Someone will meet you at the door." A pause. "Come alone." Those were his words, not mine. She looked at Webb again. He'd heard it. His expression said, non-negotiable. "Understood," she said, and ended the call. Webb said, "I'll be across the street." "You don't have to. You know the situation better than you knew it an hour ago. I've been in this for 4 minutes. Let me be across the street." She didn't argue. They took separate cabs to Red Hook. She watched the city go by, the BQE, the industrial waterfront, the slow grind of a borough that didn't care about the drama of the island to the north. The water appeared, gray and flat under October sky. The cab stopped a block from the pier. She walked the last block with the gym bag over her shoulder and the cold air off the water in her face, and her heartbeat doing something complicated. Not fast, just different, thicker. The warehouse was where the woman on the phone had said, 3rd building from the water, south side, a metal door. She knocked. The door opened, and it wasn't Garrett. It was a man she'd never seen before. Mid-40s, solid, with the kind of face that didn't communicate anything useful. He looked at her, looked at the bag, and said, "Come in." She hesitated. The space between the door and her position felt suddenly very important. "Where's Garrett?" she said. "Inside, he's okay. Come in." She looked across the street. She couldn't see Webb, which could mean he was positioned somewhere useful or could mean she was alone. She stepped inside. The warehouse was large and mostly empty. Concrete floor, high corrugated ceiling, light from grimy skylights. There were pallets stacked along one wall and a folding table with a laptop open in the middle of the space. Garrett was at the table. He was a slight man, 47, with glasses and the specific look of someone who'd been running on stress and coffee for 36 hours. When he saw her, his face registered relief and something else that she was a half-second too late in reading. Behind him, standing near the pallets, was Vincent Russo. She stopped moving. The door closed behind her. The man who'd opened it was behind her now. The gym bag was on her shoulder. The drive was in the bag. Her hands were empty. Garrett looked at her, and she watched his face do something she'd never anticipated. Something that moved from relief to guilt, to the particular collapse of a person who has made a choice they can't take back and are now experiencing its reality for the first time. "Vivian," he said, and his voice was wrecked. "I'm sorry, they have my daughter." She didn't look away from Vincent. Vincent said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her with that same filing away expression from the kitchen, except that in the kitchen there had been a table between them, and now there was maybe 20 feet of open concrete floor. "The bag," he said. She didn't move. "Vivian." He said her name in exactly the tone Dante used when he wanted something done without discussion. "The bag." How long have you had Garrett? Since this morning. 2 hours after Dante called me. Vincent took a step toward her, unhurried, the walk of a man who understood the geometry of the room. You're smart enough to have planned for a lot of things. I'll give you that. You're not the first person who's tried to build a case against Dante, and I want you to know that because what you put together was genuinely impressive. But I've been at this longer than you've been doing anything. Garrett, she said without looking away from Vincent. Where's his daughter? Garrett's voice broke slightly. She's at school. They know which school. She'll stay at school, Vincent said. Nobody's going to hurt a child. I want you to hear me say that clearly. The child is not a target. Then why? Because I needed you to understand that this isn't theoretical anymore. He stopped 10 feet from her. The bag, Vivian. She felt the man behind her step closer, close enough that she could hear him breathing, everything she'd built, every night at the desk while Dante slept, every encrypted file, every copied ledger, every careful, methodical piece of it assembled over 18 months of calculated patience. The copies, Washington, the safety deposit box, Belling. Compromised, possibly. She didn't know how far Vincent had reached while she'd been in Brooklyn drinking cold coffee with Marcus Webb. She thought about Frank Caruso. She took the gym bag off her shoulder. She held it out and felt the weight of it leave her hand. This small thing, this ordinary bag that had carried the structure of everything, and watched Vincent take it and set it on the concrete floor and crouch down and unzip the outer pocket. He found the drive in 4 seconds. He held it up, looked at it, looked at her. Is this the only one? He said. She looked at him. Vivian, I need you to tell me if this is the only copy. She looked at him and said nothing and felt something move through her that wasn't quite courage and wasn't quite grief, but was something in the narrow space between them. A recognition that she had arrived at a place where no version of her old plan survived, and where whatever came next was going to require something she hadn't needed to use yet. She thought of the safety deposit box in New Jersey, the one under her birth name, the one Dante didn't know existed. She looked at Vincent Russo and she lied. Yes, she said. That's everything. He watched her face for 5 seconds. 10. The warehouse was very quiet. Garrett was looking at the floor. Then Vincent stood up, put the drive in his coat pocket, and said to the man behind her, Take her phone. Both of them. The phones were taken. She let them go. You're going to stay here, Vincent said, until Dante decides what to do next. You're not in danger. You have my word on that, which I understand means very little to you right now. Less than very little, she said. Regardless. He picked up the gym bag and handed it back to her, the gesture, bizarrely, almost courteous. Sit down. This is going to take a few hours. He walked to the far side of the warehouse, took out his own phone, and made a call. The man who'd been behind her moved to the door. Garrett sat at the table and looked at nothing and held himself very still in the way of someone who was trying not to come apart in a room full of people he was afraid of. Vivian sat down on an overturned crate near the folding table. She put the empty gym bag on the floor between her feet and looked at the grimy skylights and thought very carefully about a safety deposit box in New Jersey and a key that was sewn into the lining of a coat in the back of a closet she'd already left behind. The warehouse smelled like rust and cold salt air. Outside, somewhere on the street that Vincent didn't know Webb was watching, a car moved past and was gone. She sat with her hands in her lap and breathed and thought. There was still one piece that Vincent hadn't touched, and she was going to have to become someone she'd never let herself be. Not the patient, methodical architect working in the dark, not the careful wife building her exit in silence, but something colder and more direct and considerably more dangerous. She was going to have to stop waiting and start burning things down herself. She counted the minutes by the light through the skylights. The warehouse had no clock, and they'd taken both her phones, so she tracked time the way she used to track it in depositions, by the quality of the light, by the movement of shadow across the concrete floor, by the rhythm of her own breathing. Vincent was on his phone in the far corner for the first 40 minutes. The man at the door. She'd started thinking of him as the doorman, because naming things helped her think, shifted his weight every 7 minutes with the regularity of someone fighting boredom. Garrett hadn't moved from the folding table. He was staring at the laptop screen with the blank intensity of a man who'd turned himself off rather than feel what he'd done. She didn't blame Garrett. She'd had time to think about it, and she didn't blame him. A man's child was a different kind of leverage than money or fear. It was the kind that reached into the part of a person that existed before reason and grabbed hold and didn't let go. She would have done the same. Almost anyone would. She sat on the overturned crate and thought about the safety deposit box. New Jersey. The box under her birth name. Hart. The key was in the lining of a coat she'd left in the closet of the townhouse she'd walked out of through the service corridor that morning with Rosa watching her go. The coat was a charcoal wool Burberry, 3 seasons old, hanging at the very back of the closet on the left side. The key was sewn into the inner seam of the right pocket, not the pocket itself but the lining below it, in a small cut she'd made with nail scissors and restitched herself. Getting to that coat required getting out of this warehouse. Getting out of this warehouse required either that Vincent let her go, which depended on what Dante decided, and Dante was deciding something that she could read in Vincent's body language from 40 feet away. In the way he held the phone and the way his free hand made a particular closed gesture she'd seen him use in difficult conversations, or that something changed the geometry of the room. She thought about Webb. He'd been across the street when she went in. He'd had no way to know what was on the other side of the door. But he was a former investigator with 18 months of resentment toward the man who'd killed his life's work. And he'd been watching the door, and she had to decide how much she was willing to bet on what he would or wouldn't do with what he was observing from across the street. She decided she was willing to bet a great deal. She needed to do something that would give Webb a reason to move. She looked at the doorman. She looked at the distance between her crate and the folding table where Garrett sat. She looked at the laptop on the table. Open, connected. She could see the glow of it from here. She didn't know if the warehouse had its own network or if Garrett had used a hotspot. She looked at Garrett's jacket hanging on the back of his chair and thought about where a man like Garrett, cautious, professional, a journalist who understood operational security, would keep his phone. Vincent finished his call. He stood in the far corner for a moment looking at his own phone, and then he walked toward her. She watched him come. She kept her face neutral. He stopped 6 feet from her and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her all morning. That filing away expression, that continuous quiet assessment. Dante wants to talk to you, he said. In person. Here? No, he's coming to the city. 3 hours. 3 hours. She looked at the skylights. The light had moved. And until then? Until then, you stay here. He paused. Are you hungry? The question was so incongruous that she almost laughed. No, she said. There's water. He gestured toward a case of bottles near the pallets. She nodded without looking at them. He started to turn away and she said, Vincent? He stopped. How long have you known about Donovan, about the federal contact? He turned back. His face gave her nothing. Because I want to understand the structure, she said, not to use it. I just want to understand how long it's been in place, whether it predates me. He watched her for a moment. Long time, he said, before I came into the picture. Long before. So the whole time I was building toward the prosecutorial channel. There was never a prosecutorial channel, Vincent said. Not unkindly, just accurately. Not one that would have worked. She nodded. She filed that away. Thank you, she said. He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he'd mostly stopped expecting to hear. Then he walked back to his corner. She sat with what he'd told her. The prosecutorial route had always been compromised. That meant that even if she'd followed her original timeline perfectly, even if she'd had her full 8 days, even if Belling's call had gone somewhere else, even if none of this morning had happened, she would have walked her evidence straight into a system designed to absorb and neutralize it. All 18 months of planning had contained a structural flaw she hadn't found until too late. The anger that moved through her at that realization was clean and cold, very different from grief. It cleared her thinking rather than clouding it, which meant Garrett had always been the only real path. Publication. Public record. The one channel that Donovan couldn't suppress after the fact. And Garrett was 6 feet away from her, and Garrett's laptop was open. And Garrett had made a choice under duress that he clearly couldn't live with, and she was going to use all 3 of those facts. She waited 20 minutes. Let Vincent settle back into his phone. Let the doorman complete 4 of his 7-minute wait shifts. Let the quality of light through the skylight shift slightly toward afternoon. Then she stood up, picked up the gym bag, and walked to the water. Nobody stopped her. She was walking toward the pallets, away from the door, reducing escape potential from the doorman's perspective. She picked up a water bottle, cracked it, drank from it, stood near the pallets looking at nothing in particular. Then she turned and walked to the folding table and sat down across from Garrett. He looked up at her. His eyes were red at the rims, and he had the look of a man who'd been swallowing something large for several hours. "The laptop," she said quietly, barely moving her lips. "Is it connected?" His eyes flickered toward Vincent. Vincent was on the phone again, turned away. "Hotspot," Garrett breathed. "My own. They didn't take it." "The archive." "Garrett." She held his eyes. "I need you to listen to me. I don't have the drive anymore. But the preliminary materials you received 2 weeks ago, the preview package I sent you, you still have that. It's enough to publish a first piece, not everything. One piece, big enough that it can't be retracted, big enough that other journalists pick it up within hours and start filing their own inquiries." She kept her voice at the lowest register that was still language. "And I have 3 more copies of the full archive that they don't know about. But I need to get out of here to get to them. And I need something to happen that changes the geometry of this room." Garrett's hands were flat on the table. She could see them trembling slightly. "If you publish anything from here," he said, "they'll know it came from—" "I know. That's the point." She held his eyes. "I need Vincent to know. I need him to call Dante. I need 30 seconds of everyone in this room looking at Vincent instead of me." Garrett looked at her. She watched something move through him, the journalist's instinct colliding with the terrified father, and she waited for it to resolve. "My daughter," he said, "is at school. Vincent told me himself she's not a target. He's not going to move on a child with a publication already in motion. That's exposure he can't afford." She paused. "I know I'm asking you to trust that. I know I have no right to ask you that." He sat with it for 5 seconds. 10. Then he turned to the laptop. She stood up and walked back to the water pallets, moving slowly, gym bag over her shoulder, watching Vincent's back. She picked up a second water bottle and stood there and waited. Garrett worked for 4 minutes. She could see his shoulders, the angle of his head, the small movement of his hands on the keyboard. She could see the moment he hit publish. His shoulders dropped, almost imperceptibly, the release of someone who has committed to something irreversible. He turned and looked at her. She gave him nothing, just looked back. Then he said loudly enough that it carried across the warehouse, "Mr. Russo." Vincent turned from his corner. "You should look at this," Garrett said. The next 12 seconds moved in a specific way that she'd run through in her mind, in the abstract, and now experienced in her body. The way time stretches and thickens when the thing you've been preparing for arrives and is simultaneously exactly what you expected and completely different. Vincent moved toward the table. The doorman's attention followed Vincent. Both of them converged on Garrett and the laptop screen, and for a period of time between 10 and 15 seconds, there were 3 men looking at a screen on the far side of a warehouse. She walked to the door, not running, walking. Her heart was doing something seismic in her chest, and her hands were completely numb, and she walked at the pace of someone leaving a room for ordinary reasons, and put her hand on the door handle and pushed. Cold air. Daylight. The waterfront, the smell of the harbor, the sound of traffic on the street at the far end of the pier. She heard Vincent's voice behind her. Sharp, controlled. Not a shout. "Stop her!" And then she was running. She ran along the pier toward the street, and she could hear footsteps behind her. The doorman, closing fast because he was 30 years younger and not carrying anything except the momentum of a man who did this professionally. She cut left at the end of the pier onto the waterfront road and almost went into the side of a delivery truck pulling out of a lot and shoved off the passenger door with both hands and kept moving, and her lungs were already burning because she hadn't run like this in years, and the cold air was a blade going in. The footsteps were still behind her. She ran half a block and a car pulled up hard alongside her. Silver, moving parallel, and the passenger window came down and Webb said, "Get in." She got in. The door wasn't fully closed before he accelerated, moving north on the waterfront road, and she pulled the door shut and pressed back into the seat and breathed and felt the warehouse getting smaller behind them. "How bad?" Webb said. They have the drive. She was still catching her breath. Garrett published the preview piece. It's out. Webb looked at his mirrors. How much is in the preview? Enough. Shell companies, account identifiers, the exit structure. Not Donovan. I kept that out of the preliminary materials. She pulled air in. I need to get to New Jersey. There's a safety deposit box. That's the only full copy left that they don't know about. Bank name? She told him. He took a turn west, moved them off the waterfront and into surface streets, navigating with the focused calm of someone who was not thinking about what had just happened, but exclusively about what needed to happen next. She sat beside him and let her heartbeat come down from whatever it had been, and watched the city pass and thought about the coat in the closet and the key in the lining. The townhouse, she said. What about it? The key to the box is there, in the closet. Webb glanced at her. Tell me you're joking. I'm not. There are surveillance vehicles on that building. Possibly men inside by now. I know. So you want to go back to a building that Dante Moretti's organization is watching, walk in through whatever entrance you think is still clear, get a key out of a coat pocket, and then drive to New Jersey. The service corridor on 73rd is still clear, as far as I know, and Rosa is there. The housekeeper. She helped me this morning without being asked. Vivian looked at him. She's been in that house 9 years. She's seen things. I think she's been waiting for a reason. Webb drove in silence for a moment. His jaw had a set to it she was starting to recognize as his version of working through something he didn't like. If they've moved anyone inside the building, then we find out when we get there. And if Dante arrives early, he's coming to the city. You said 3 hours. That was 40 minutes ago. She looked at the time on his dashboard. We have 2 hours and 20 minutes, roughly. Roughly, Webb repeated. Do you have a better plan? He drove. Neither of them said anything for a block and a half. No, he said. They went north. She watched her phone. The regular one was gone, taken in the warehouse, but Webb had a phone she could use and she watched the screen as he drove, checking for the publication. It went live 18 minutes after she'd walked out of the warehouse door, a piece under Garrett's byline, 3,000 words, with account identifiers and shell company registrations and a structural overview of the financial operation that was specific enough to be undeniable and explosive enough that within 40 minutes it had been picked up by 2 larger outlets and a wire service. She watched the shares accumulate on Webb's phone screen as they moved through Brooklyn toward the bridge. Watched the number climb. Watched the story move into the world the way things moved in this specific era. Not like a stone dropped in water, circles spreading outward, but like something combusted, all directions simultaneously, immediate and total. It's out, she said. I can see that, Webb said. They can't stop it now. They can still stop you. She looked at the bridge ahead of them, the city rising on the other side of the water, gray and enormous and going about its business. I know, she said. The townhouse was quiet. The Audi was still on the street. She saw it from a block away, and Webb drove past without slowing, circled the block, parked on the east side. No Escalade. Either it had moved or it was positioned somewhere she couldn't see. 15 minutes, Webb said. In and out. She nodded. She got out of the car and walked to the alley entrance on 73rd and found the service door and used the building staff code that Rosa had shown her, the backup code, the one the residents weren't supposed to know but which Rosa had written on a piece of paper and pressed into her hand this morning without comment, the way you press something into someone's hand when you've decided to take a side. The basement corridor was empty. Cold concrete, industrial lights, the smell of old building. She moved through it and took the stairs to the lobby level and came out near the elevator. The lobby was empty. She took the elevator up. The apartment was quiet. Rosa was in the sitting room, and when she heard the elevator, she came to the doorway, and the look on her face when she saw Vivian was the look of a woman who had spent the last 2 hours preparing for something and was relieved the preparation hadn't been wasted. They called, Rosa said. 2 men, 40 minutes ago. They said they were building security, but they weren't. I told them you weren't here, and I didn't know when you'd be back. Did they come in? I didn't let them. Vivian looked at her for a moment. 9 years. She'd been in this house 9 years and apparently seen things the whole time. I need the coat, Vivian said. The charcoal Burberry in the back of the bedroom closet, and then I need to be gone in 4 minutes. Rosa was already moving. She came back with a coat in 90 seconds. Vivian took it, felt the right pocket lining, felt the hard, small shape of the key through the fabric. She got the nail scissors from the bathroom, cut the lining, extracted the key. She looked at Rosa. "When I'm gone," she said, "take the rest of today off. Go see your sister in Queens. Don't come back here for a week." Rosa looked at her with that careful, expressionless face. "Will you be okay?" The question landed differently than Vivian expected. She stood in the hallway of the house she'd lived in for 11 years, holding a safety deposit box key in her palm. And the question pulled at something she didn't have time to let it pull at. "I think so," she said. "Thank you, Rosa. For this morning. For all of it." Rosa nodded once, the way she'd nodded at thousands of requests over 9 years, except that this one meant something completely different from all of them. Vivian went back down the service corridor. Webb was where she'd left him. She got in the car and held up the key, and he pulled away from the curb without a word. They were across the bridge and into New Jersey in 22 minutes. The bank was a regional branch in a quiet commercial block in a town she'd chosen specifically for its distance from anything connected to Dante's operational territory. She'd opened the box 4 years before she met him, which made her feel, in this specific moment, something she didn't have a precise name for. A recognition of the person she'd been before. The careful, self-sufficient, thorough woman who'd existed independently of Dante Moretti and had apparently, somewhere deep down, never fully stopped existing. She signed in under Hart. The clerk didn't look at her twice. The box contained what she'd put there 8 months ago when she'd first understood what she was dealing with. A full copy of the archive on 2 separate drives, a printed summary of the key documentation with source references, and a sealed envelope addressed to a name she hadn't discussed with anyone. Not Belling, not Garrett, not Webb. A name she'd found during her research into Donovan's division, a federal attorney in the Southern District whose record showed no connection to any of Dante's known operations, who'd prosecuted 3 organized crime cases in the past 6 years without a single dismissal, and whose personal financial disclosure forms she'd spent 2 weeks analyzing with her professional eye and found spotlessly clean. Her name was Diana Farrow. The sealed envelope contained a complete brief, written in Vivian's own hand, addressed to Farrow specifically, laying out the full architecture of the case, including the Donovan connection and the evidence that supported it. She took both drives and the envelope, left the box empty, signed out. In the car, she sat with the envelope in her lap and looked at it for a moment. Webb said, "What is it?" "The version of this that works," she said. "The one I built for a situation where every other version failed." She looked at the drives in her hand. The story was already moving in the world. Garrett's piece was burning through the internet at a velocity that nobody could stop now. Within hours, other journalists would be calling sources, filing requests, pushing at the edges of what was public. The financial structure was cracked open. What Garrett had was enough to sustain the story for days. What she was holding was enough to end it. But she was sitting in a car in New Jersey with 2 surveillance vehicles, probably running her description through every bridge camera in the 5 boroughs, with Dante arriving in the city in what was now approximately 90 minutes, with Vincent Russo in possession of her primary drive and in full understanding that she'd lied to him about the copies. She opened Webb's phone and searched for Diana Farrow's office number. It rang twice. A receptionist. Then, "Please hold for Attorney Farrow." Then a woman's voice, precise, unhurried. "This is Farrow." "My name is Vivian Hart," she said. "I was Vivian Moretti. I believe you'll recognize that name in connection with the story that published 43 minutes ago." A brief silence on the line. Not surprised. Calculating. "I saw it," Farrow said. "What you saw is 3% of what I have. I'm in New Jersey with 2 drives and a complete evidentiary brief. I can be in your office in 45 minutes, she paused. "But I need to know one thing first." "Ask it." "Thomas Donovan. Do you know him?" The silence this time told her everything before Farrow spoke. It was the silence of a person who had been waiting for someone to say that name in a specific context for a specific amount of time. "I've been building a case on Donovan for 14 months, Farrow said quietly. "I've been waiting for someone with direct documentation." Vivian closed her eyes for 1 second. "I have it," she said. "Then get here," Farrow said. "Now. I'm going to make 2 calls while you're driving. Vivian ended the call and looked at Webb. Drive. He drove. The bridge came up through the windshield. The city on the other side, enormous and gray and full of the lives of people who didn't know that a structure built on years of violence and theft was beginning, at this specific moment, to come apart at every seam simultaneously. Vivian sat with the drives in one hand and the envelope in the other and felt her own heartbeat, which had stopped being seismic and had settled into something deliberate and even. Webb's phone buzzed on the dashboard. A news alert, then another, then three more in quick succession. She looked at the screen. The first alert was from a major wire service. Breaking. Federal sources confirm investigation into Moretti Financial Network. Following document release. The second was from a financial news outlet, Auric Meridian Holdings, connected to offshore accounts. In multiple jurisdictions, documents show. The third was from a general news source, and its headline was the one that told her the things she needed to know. Source close to investigation. Multiple arrests expected. She set the phone back on the dash. Dante was somewhere in the air above the Atlantic, or in a car moving toward the city he thought he still controlled, and he didn't know yet that the ground had already gone. He was going to find out very soon. Webb accelerated onto the bridge, and the city came at them through the glass, and she sat up straight in the seat and breathed and looked at the skyline, and for the first time in 18 months felt something she hadn't let herself feel. Not peace, not yet, but the specific charged clarity of a woman who has put every piece she had on the board and is watching the game resolve in real time. It wasn't over. She knew that. There were still pieces in motion. Vincent had her drive. Dante was still coming. There were men in the city who worked for him and would work for him until they didn't, and that transition was not instant and not clean. But Diana Farrow was making 2 calls, and Garrett's story was burning. And in 45 minutes, she was going to walk into a federal building with 2 drives and an envelope and put the final architecture of Dante Moretti's empire into hands that were clean enough to use it. She put the drives in the envelope's breast pocket, held it against her chest with one hand. Outside, the city moved toward them. And in an office in Lower Manhattan, Diana Farrow was already on the phone with the first of her 2 calls, saying words that Vivian couldn't hear but could imagine, had been imagining for 18 months, the specific formal language of the law finally moving toward the thing it was supposed to move toward. The bridge ended. The city received them. And somewhere behind them, on a private airfield in New Jersey that Vivian had known about for 6 months, a plane carrying Dante Moretti touched down on the runway, and the last act began. Diana Farrow's office was on the 14th floor of a federal building in Lower Manhattan, and it looked exactly like what it was. A room where serious people did serious work without much concern for how it appeared. Stack of case files on the desk, 2 whiteboards covered in names and arrows and dates, a window with a view of the street below that nobody ever looked at because there was always something more urgent to look at in the room. Farrow herself was 53, with close-cropped gray hair and a stillness about her that Vivian recognized immediately. The stillness of someone who had learned that patience was a weapon and had been using it for a long time. She stood up when Vivian came in, looked at her face, looked at the envelope in her hand, and said, "Sit down. Water?" "No," Vivian said. "Thank you, Vivian." She sat. Webb had dropped her at the building entrance and parked. He was downstairs, in the lobby, which was as far as he'd agreed to stay back, and Vivian had come up alone with the envelope and both drives, and the specific feeling of a person who has been running for 36 hours and has finally arrived somewhere solid. She put the envelope on Farrow's desk. Farrow looked at it without touching it. "Walk me through it," she said. "From the beginning. I've read the published piece. Tell me what's not in it." Vivian talked for 40 minutes. She was precise and organized, which surprised her a little. She'd expected to be more ragged, more depleted, but there was something about sitting across from a person who received what she was saying without flinching that activated the professional part of her brain, the part that had spent a decade making complicated things comprehensible. She laid out the structure, the shell companies, the account flows, the exit timeline, the Donovan connection with the specific documentation that supported it, the Caruso information, the full architecture of a criminal enterprise that had been operating beneath layers of legitimacy for 20 years. Farrow asked 3 questions during the 40 minutes, all of them precise, all of them aimed at the load-bearing elements of the case. She took no notes. She was the kind of person who didn't need to. When Vivian finished, Farrow sat back in her chair and was quiet for a moment. "The Donovan material?" she said. "If this holds up..." "It holds up," Vivian said. "I spent 2 weeks on those documents specifically. I know what I'm reading. It implicates him in obstruction dating back at least 6 years. At least." Farrow looked at the envelope. "You said you addressed this to me specifically, before today, before we'd spoken. 7 months ago, I researched you for 3 weeks before I sealed it." Farrow absorbed that. "Why?" Vivian looked at her. "Because your financial disclosures were clean. Because your case record didn't have any of the specific discontinuities I'd associate with external interference. And because your name appeared in a communication between Russo and Donovan as someone they'd identified as a potential liability." She paused. "They were worried about you. That was sufficient recommendation." Something moved in Farrow's face. Not quite a smile, but the muscular memory of one. She picked up her phone, made a call, said 4 sentences into it in a tone that left no room for interpretation or delay, and hung up. "I've had an open file on Donovan for 14 months, she said. "I've been waiting for something I could move on without tipping him first. This is that something." She looked at Vivian directly. "You understand what happens next involves a significant amount of institutional machinery that is going to be in motion before the end of today. I know. And you understand your own position in that machinery? I'm the source. I'm potentially a witness. I need protection, and I need it formalized before the end of today." She met Farrow's eyes. "Which is why I'm here instead of somewhere else." Farrow nodded once. "I'll need you in this building for the next several hours while we establish the framework. Can you do that?" "Yes." "And the man downstairs? Webb. He's clean. Former financial crimes. He left the division over the Marchetti case. He's been a peripheral support for the last 12 hours. He's not a principal." "I know who Webb is," Farrow said, with a flatness that told Vivian that Webb's name had come up in Farrow's own investigations at some point. "Tell him to come up." Vivian texted the lobby with Farrow's phone. Then she sat back in the chair and looked at the window she couldn't see out of, and listened to the machinery of the federal building going about its work around her. Footsteps in the corridor, phones, the movement of files and decisions, and the slow grinding gears of an institution that could be corrupted and compromised and delayed but could not, ultimately, be stopped entirely. It was not a romantic thought. It was just a fact she was choosing to rely on. Webb came up. Farrow spoke to him briefly, assessed him with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything, and directed him to a chair against the wall. He sat down and looked at Vivian and gave her a small nod that meant something she didn't try to translate into words. The next 3 hours were the strangest of her life. Stranger than the night on the kitchen floor. Stranger than the warehouse. Stranger even than the elevator ride down from the Midtown penthouse 4 days ago that now felt like something that had happened to a person she used to be. She sat in federal offices while lawyers and investigators moved through the building with the specific energy of people who've been handed something they've been waiting for and are now running with it. She was interviewed twice, formally, recorded with an attorney present, Farrow arranging a public defender on short notice as a placeholder until Vivian could make her own representation arrangements. She answered every question completely. She held nothing back. At 4:17 in the afternoon, she heard, from a room she was sitting in, with a junior investigator who was organizing the drive contents into an evidence framework, the sound of a television someone had turned up in an adjacent office. She couldn't make out words, but she heard the particular register of breaking news coverage, that specific accelerating urgency in a broadcaster's voice, and the junior investigator's phone lit up with multiple alerts in rapid succession, and he looked at the screen and then looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "What is it?" she said. He turned the phone toward her. "Moretti detained. Federal agents take Dante Moretti into custody at Teterboro Airport. Multiple simultaneous raids across tri-state area." She read it twice, not because she didn't understand it the first time, because she needed a moment with it. She handed the phone back. "Thank you," she said, and didn't say anything else. What she felt in that moment was not triumph. She would think about that afterward, during the long weeks that followed, trying to locate the feeling more precisely. It wasn't relief exactly either, though relief was part of it. It was something more like the feeling you get when you've been holding a great weight at arm's length for so long that your arms have stopped registering the strain. And then you set it down, and for a moment you can't feel your arms at all. Not pain, not release, just a kind of profound and disorienting absence of the thing that had been defining your experience for longer than you'd realized. She'd been holding Dante Moretti at arm's length for a long time, longer than 18 months. She suspected she'd been holding him at arm's length since approximately year 4 of their marriage, when she'd first understood what he was fully and had made the decision, not conscious exactly, but real, to not look directly at it. She'd been paying the cost of that decision ever since. She set it down now. The raids were simultaneous and coordinated, which she learned over the following hours in fragments. 6 locations in New York, 3 in New Jersey, 1 in Connecticut, warehouses, offices, the accounts department of a legitimate business in Midwood that had been laundering money for 11 years. Vincent Russo was arrested at his apartment in the West 70s at 4:45 in the afternoon, which meant he'd gone home after the warehouse, which meant he'd believed the situation was resolved, which meant her lie had bought her exactly the time she'd needed it to. Thomas Donovan was placed on administrative leave by end of business and had 3 federal attorneys in a room with him before dinner. Sienna Vale's legal team contacted Farrow's office at 6 p.m., offering cooperation in exchange for consideration of her position. Farrow's office received the call and gave nothing back. They'd deal with Sienna when they got to Sienna. There was a sequence to these things. Vivian was in the federal building until 9:30 that evening. When she finally walked out into the night, Webb beside her, both of them silent in the way of people who have used all available language, the city was doing what the city always did, which was to continue existing with complete indifference to the events occurring within it. Cabs moving, a food cart operator closing up for the night, 2 men arguing in a doorway about something she couldn't hear. The lights of Lower Manhattan reflected in wet pavement because it had rained while she was inside, which she hadn't known. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed cold air. "Where do you go?" Webb said. She thought about it. The townhouse was not an option. Not practically, and not in any other sense either. That house was done. It would be involved in the asset seizure process, and she had no desire to stand in those rooms again, no desire to pick up the life that had been lived in them. There was a hotel. There was always a hotel. She had access to funds in her own name, not the settlement, that would take time, but her own accounts, the ones she'd maintained independently throughout the marriage without thinking about why. "Hotel," she said. "Tonight. And then I'll figure out the rest." Webb nodded. He looked like a man who understood that question. The after question, the what now question that arrives once the thing you've been doing is finished and the space it occupied is suddenly empty. "You did good work," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. More like a professional assessment. A statement of fact from someone qualified to evaluate the fact. "So did you," she said. "Thank you for the diner and the car and staying across the street." He looked at her for a moment. "You would have found another way." "Maybe." "You would have. You'd been finding other ways for 18 months. She didn't argue. They stood on the sidewalk for another moment and then went their separate directions, and she watched him walk away and thought that she would probably talk to him again. He was going to be a witness in a federal case, and so was she. And the legal process was going to create a structure of continued contact for months or years, but that the specific quality of this particular collaboration was finished, and that was its own kind of thing to sit with. She got a cab. Hotel in Midtown. Anonymous. Not the kind of place she'd have chosen in any previous life, but exactly right for tonight. She paid in cash, which she still had from the amount she'd been keeping on herself for the last 3 weeks. Rode the elevator up, sat on the edge of the hotel bed in her coat, and looked at the wall. She sat there for a long time. She thought about Dante. Not about what he'd done, not about the empire and the accounts and the exit plan. She'd thought about all of that exhaustively, had turned it over and examined it from every angle for the better part of 2 years, and she was finished with that particular examination. She thought about him as a person. The man who'd kissed her on the temple in the kitchen on an ordinary morning and told her he'd call. The man who'd said that was not supposed to happen about Frank Caruso, which was true and also meaningless, and whose voice had cracked on her name in the Midtown penthouse in a way she'd chosen not to turn around for. She thought about Rome and Last Christmas and the early years when he'd looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in any room, which she had been, and which he'd subsequently spent considerable energy ensuring she would never feel the need to demonstrate again. She'd loved him. Past tense was the only honest tense available for that statement now, but past tense didn't make it not true. She had loved him, and she had let that love make her smaller for 12 years. And he had let him, and had depended on it, had built the upper floors of his empire on the assumption of her silence and her patience and her capacity to look away from the thing she knew was there. He'd been wrong about that. Not because she hadn't been all of those things, she had been for a long time, but because you could only remain smaller than yourself for so long before the part of you that knew what you were capable of started pushing back. She wondered if he understood that yet. If somewhere in the sequence of today, the detention, the formal arrest, the arrival of lawyers and charges, and the machinery of consequence, he had arrived at the understanding that he'd never been defeated by an enemy, by a rival, by the federal government, or the Financial Crimes Division, or any of the forces he'd spent 20 years maneuvering against. He'd been defeated by his own assessment of his wife, by the decision, made across 1,000 small moments over 12 years, to see her as furniture. She thought about that. And then she took off her coat and hung it on the hook behind the door and got into the hotel bed and slept for 11 hours without moving. The weeks that followed were not peaceful. She hadn't expected them to be. There was the legal process, testimony, documentation review, formal interviews, the careful construction of a prosecutorial record that Pharaoh's office built with the methodical thoroughness of people who understood that Dante's defense team would be among the most expensive in the country and that the case needed to be airtight at every joint. Vivian cooperated fully. She answered every question put to her by every attorney on both sides of the process because she had nothing to hide and no desire to pretend otherwise. The Donovan matter moved on a separate track. It was messier. Institutional corruption always was. But Pharaoh had her 14 months of groundwork and Vivian's documentation and a federal machinery that, once convinced of its own compromise, applied considerable energy toward cleaning it up. Donovan resigned in week 3. Federal charges came in week 7. He did not attempt to minimize his cooperation. Vincent Russo flipped in week 2. She heard about it through Pharaoh's office and felt nothing in particular except a tired recognition of the inevitable. Vincent had always been a practical man, and practical men, when the structure they've operated within collapses completely, make practical decisions about their own survival. He gave them everything. Names, dates, the full operational history of 25 years. He talked for weeks. The transcripts, when portions of them were eventually made available to her legal team, were staggering in their detail and their flatness. A man giving a complete account of a life lived in service of organized violence, in the same tone he might use to describe a series of business transactions, which was, she supposed, exactly what it had been to him. Sienna Vale cooperated fully as well, and earlier than anyone had expected. She was 26 years old and had made decisions that were going to follow her for the rest of her life, and whatever else Vivian thought about her. And she'd worked to think as little about her as possible, because there was no version of that particular emotional territory that was useful. She was young enough that there was still a rest of her life to consider. The charges against Sienna were reduced significantly in exchange for her testimony. She gave a statement to a federal investigator in which she described, in clinical detail, exactly how Dante had recruited her into the financial structure, exactly what she'd understood about the money she was signing for, and exactly when she'd understood that her signature had made her a participant rather than merely a witness. She was 23 when it started. Vivian sat with that number for a while. The legal settlement was protracted and complex in the way that all legal matters touching organized crime and asset seizure are protracted and complex. Her personal assets, the ones in her own name, the ones predating the marriage, the accounts she'd maintained independently, were separated from the seized estate with relative clarity. The marital assets were more complicated. She had a good attorney, a woman she'd found through a referral from Pharaoh's office, and the woman was very good, and the outcome was as fair as outcomes got in situations like this. She didn't take more than what was clearly hers. That was a decision she made early and held to, not because she was indifferent to money, but because she understood, with the forensic clarity that had been the defining feature of her professional mind for 20 years, that every dollar she took from Dante's estate was a dollar that existed because of what he'd done and what he'd cost people. She wanted to be clean. She wanted the rest of her life to be built on something that was actually hers. She put most of what she received into the foundation. It took 8 months to structure properly. A legal entity established under her birth name, Heart, designed to provide support for whistleblowers, journalists, and victims of organized crime. She worked with 3 attorneys and a nonprofit specialist to build it with the same methodical care she'd applied to building the case, and the result was something solid, something real, something that would exist and function after she'd moved on to whatever came next. The trial itself was the most publicized organized crime proceeding in several years. She testified on the 4th day, in a courtroom so still while she spoke that she could hear the court reporter's keystrokes. She was on the stand for 6 hours across 2 sessions. She answered every question in the voice she used when she was at her most professional. Not cold, not emotional, just precise. She described what she'd found, how she'd found it, and what she'd done with it. Dante's attorneys were thorough. They challenged her access to the documents, her methods of obtaining them, her motivations. They implied she'd fabricated or manipulated evidence to retaliate for personal betrayal. She answered each challenge with the specific documented counter-evidence she'd anticipated they would require, because she had anticipated all of it, had spent her time in federal protection preparing for exactly this. When the cross-examination was finished, Dante's lead attorney sat down with the expression of someone who had done the best they could with what they had, and knew it wasn't enough. She looked at Dante once, during her testimony. Only once. He was looking at her across the courtroom with an expression she'd spent months trying to prepare herself to see. It was not rage. It was not the cold calculation she'd seen in the penthouse that night. It was something quieter and, she thought, more honest than almost anything she'd seen on his face in 12 years. It was the expression of a man who was understanding something about himself that he'd had the resources to avoid understanding until now. She held his eyes for 3 seconds and looked away. She didn't look at him again. The verdict came on a Tuesday, in November, and she was not in the courtroom for it. She was in Florence by then, had been in Florence for 3 weeks. She'd made the decision to go before the verdict. Her testimony was complete, her obligations to the legal process fulfilled in their essential form, and she'd understood that staying in New York to watch the end of it would be doing something for the wrong reason. Watching the verdict wouldn't add anything to what had already been done. It would just be a thing she did because she couldn't stop. Like pressing a bruise. Like returning to the scene of something she'd already survived. She was done pressing bruises. Florence in November was gray and cold and beautiful in the specific way of cities that have been accumulating beauty for so long that it's present even in the difficult light, even on the ordinary streets far from the famous places. She'd rented an apartment in the Old Trarno on the south side of the river, small, high-ceilinged, with windows that looked out on a street where a woman sold flowers in the morning and a man repaired bicycles in the afternoon, and the smell of wood smoke came from somewhere she never identified. She spoke Italian haltingly, improving. She cooked her own food and walked long distances every day and slept long hours, recovering something she hadn't known was depleted until she stopped depleting it. She read the verdict online at a cafe 3 blocks from her apartment, on a Tuesday afternoon, over a coffee she'd made last 30 minutes. Multiple counts: racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, fraud, organized crime leadership. The sentence would be announced at a separate hearing, but the structure of the charges indicated what any informed person already knew. Dante Moretti was going to spend the remainder of his functional life incarcerated. She read the article to the end, set her phone face down on the table, looked at the street through the cafe window. Gray November street, a few people moving in coats, a cat on a windowsill across the way, doing what cats do, which is to look at everything without urgency. She waited for the triumph. She'd been told by several people at various points in the preceding months that this moment would feel like vindication, like victory, like the release of something long held. She waited for whatever that was supposed to feel like. What she felt was quieter than any of those words. She felt the particular quality of a life that had been restructured by difficulty into something truer than what it had been before. Not better, exactly. It wasn't simple enough to be better, but truer. She was 43 years old and she was sitting alone in a cafe in Florence, and she was more herself than she had been at 33 or 38 or 40, More herself than she'd been in the long, comfortable numbness of the Upper East Side. More herself than she'd been in any of the rooms where she'd made herself smaller and quieter and less likely to notice things that were better left unnoticed. She thought about Rosa. She'd sent her a letter 2 months ago, after learning that Rosa had quietly given a statement to federal investigators about Vincent Russo's visit to the townhouse. A statement that had been apparently more observationally precise than anyone had expected from a woman who'd spent 9 years performing invisibility. She hoped Rosa was okay. She thought Rosa was probably okay. Some people were more durable than they appeared, and Rosa had always appeared quite durable. She thought about Webb. He'd testified in the Donovan proceedings, and she'd heard his name in that context, but hadn't been in contact with him directly since the night she'd walked out of the federal building. She hoped the Marchetti investigation got reopened. She thought it probably would. She thought about Garrett, who had published 3 more pieces in the weeks following the warehouse, each one more comprehensive than the last, built on the materials she'd eventually gotten to him through the proper channels. He'd been nominated for something. She'd seen the notification in passing and felt genuinely glad for him in the specific way you feel glad for someone who has paid a cost and received something in proportion to it. The cat on the windowsill across the way stood up, stretched in the elongated, boneless way of cats, and stepped out of the light. She picked up her phone. No more news. Just a notification from the Foundation's attorney. A routine administrative matter, a filing deadline, something she'd deal with tomorrow. The Foundation was operational now, had already received its first 3 applications for assistance. The work was real. That was the thing she'd found in the months since leaving. The specific anchoring quality of work that was actually worth doing. She put the phone in her pocket and finished her coffee. She thought about Dante one more time, final time. Not with hatred. She'd moved through the hatred in the early weeks, had let it burn through her and hadn't tried to suppress it. And it had burned itself out the way things do when you don't feed them. Not with love. That had been accurate in its time and was finished now. With something more like the complicated, sober reckoning you apply to any major event in your life. What happened, what it cost, what it changed, what you would do differently, what you wouldn't. He'd been a man who believed that power protected him from consequence. He'd been wrong about that. Most people who believe it are wrong, eventually, but eventually can take a long time to arrive, and the damage done in the interval can be staggering. She'd been part of that damage, not the worst part, but she'd been complicit in the silence and the looking away, and she'd decided a long time ago not to flinch from that word. Complicit. It was accurate. She owned it. She'd tried in whatever limited way she could to address it. It wasn't enough to balance the ledger. She understood that. The ledger didn't balance. That was the nature of the kind of harm that had been done, that you couldn't run the numbers and arrive at 0. But she'd done what she could do. And she was going to keep doing it, through the Foundation, through whatever form her work took from here forward. That would have to be sufficient, because it was all there was. She left money on this table and put on her coat and walked out into the November street. The flowers were gone from the corner. The woman packed up at noon. But the bicycle repairman was still working, bent over a wheel with the focused absorption of someone who was good at their work and knew it. She walked past him and crossed the small bridge over a narrower part of the Arno, looking downstream at the city laid out in the gray afternoon light. Old stone, old water, things that had been here long before any of this and would be here long after. She walked back to her apartment, opened the windows despite the cold because she'd developed a habit of cold air, had come to associate it with the particular quality of being awake and present that she was trying to maintain. Made tea. Sat at the table by the window with a notebook she'd been keeping, not a diary, more like a working document, ideas about the Foundation, about the cases she was reading, about the work she was learning to want again. She picked up the pen. Outside, the street did what streets do. A child ran past, laughing at something. 2 old men stood at the corner, discussing something with the unhurried seriousness of people who had all the time they needed. A pigeon walked along the opposite windowsill, in the way pigeons do, which is to say with complete confidence that the world is exactly the right size for them. Vivian Hart, age 43, formerly Vivian Moretti, sat at a table in a rented apartment in the Oltrarno district of Florence and picked up her pen and started writing. Not the end of something, not the conclusion of the story she'd been living for the last 2 years. Just the next sentence, and the ongoing account of a woman who had learned at considerable cost The difference between the life that happens to you and the life you decide to build out of what's left. She wrote until the light outside changed, and the street grew quieter, and the cold air coming through the window was replaced by the specific evening stillness of a city that knew how to end a day without drama. Then she put the pen down. Then she closed the notebook. And outside, in the city that didn't know her name, the last of the autumn light went off the water.